Hi everybody. I'm going to try to get this done quick because my car's been having battery issues and with the light on I don't want to drain anything. So this week the challenge is the 10 books that made me. I don't know if these made me exactly, but they certainly did form a lot of what I like to read. some of my thoughts as an adult too. So all right, so the first one, okay, I don't know if anybody includes kids' books on this, but my childhood reading was very, very much a part of my life when I was, when I was young. And the first book that I really read that actually made sense was One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. Now, I struggled until I was 5, and then this book was the first book that actually, kind of came together. Like I could actually read it. Just to kind of go into a little bit of that, when my sister was very, very smart. She was a very smart child, and by the time she was 2, she was reading, and so, of course, I mean, all kids develop differently, right? But one of my very, very earliest memories is so when my mother moved into the place where I grew up, there's a bug flying around in here. My dad took us on this big, long hitchhiking trip for, I don't know how long we were gone, at least a couple of weeks. Which in itself, when you think about it, this hippie guy hitchhiking with 2 small children is quite a feat. But we went, now my sister remembers the trip a lot more clearly than I do. She told me that we went to Ottawa and Montreal primarily, and then to some property that my dad apparently owned a part of somewhere near Ottawa. And anyway, one of my memories from this time was I was very little. I was sitting on my dad's lap, and we had the book, the Dr. Seuss book, To Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, open in front of us, and I was really, really struggling to read it. My hair's sticking up, sorry. And my sister's whispering in my ear, and the word was "the." I mean, it was like the shortest little word, and my dad kind of got mad at her for trying to help me, but it just wasn't clicking. And I remember talking to my sister about it, probably a couple of years ago now, and she said, "Oh, you were just so stubborn as a little kid." And I was like, "No, I was 2 and it just wasn't gelling in my brain. I just was too young." And she had never, because she read so early, I guess she never fathomed that I wasn't doing it to be antagonistic. I just couldn't read yet. So anyway, so I struggled for the next few years, of course, because I was still pretty young. But then I was 5, and at the time my mother was working a lot of hours, so I spent mornings at kindergarten and then afternoons at the daycare center. And I remember sitting in the daycare play area, and I remember I was at a table on this little short chair, and I seem to recall there was like a toy kitchen or something nearby me, and I had this Dr. Seuss book open in front of me, and I was so determined to try to read it, and the words just didn't come together, and then all of a sudden it was just like ka-chunk. It was like a key turning in the lock, or something that was really out of focus suddenly coming into focus, and suddenly I could read. And I remember very clearly it was One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. This was the book where I finally learned to read, and from there it was just like, a flame to paper. Like, I read everything I could get my hands on from then. So book number 2, I didn't put it down as one specific book, but I think that I read all of the books that I read as a kid were important to me. And I tended to read, you know, if I liked an author, I would read as much as I could by that author. So Judy Blume, Beverly Cleary, Paula Danziger, Catherine Patterson, who wrote Bridge to Terabithia. That one was a very special book. Any of the Newbery Medal winners, I was all over it. Another one, Lois Lowry, Summer to Die. That was a good book, and that one my sister actually had a signed copy of it because Lois Lowry came and talked at our school. And Gordon Corman was another author that I really liked as a kid, and he actually came and talked to our school too. He was Canadian, and he was only, I think, 13 when he wrote the first Bruno and Boots book. So he was just this young author. So I put all of those books kind of in one category, as I read a lot as a kid, and these were some of the authors that I just really, really liked. So number 3 would be The Chronicles of Narnia. For a long time, I would reread at least one, if not the entire series, probably every year and a half. And most recently, since I've gotten Audible, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this, but every night, and I mean every night, I go to sleep with the audiobook of Chronicles of Narnia in my ears, because nothing puts me to sleep like a nice British accent reading me a story. I know it's a very weird thing, but it works. And the Chronicles of Narnia have some fantastic readers. Kenneth Branagh reads The Magician's Nephew, and Lynn Redgrave reads Prince Caspian. And my favorite and the greatest audiobook of all time is Patrick Stewart reading The Last Battle. And there's not going to be any fight on this, because that's just the hill I'm dying on. So yes, P. Stu reads me a story every night, and it's very nice. And I wish he would adopt me. Okay. Weirdness out of the way. Next is Carrie by Stephen King. Of course, Stephen King was going to come up. As a horror reader, as a fan, as a lifelong fan of Stephen King, of course, that one's going to come up. But Carrie also has the special distinction of being the first grown-up book that I ever read. I was 8 years old, and I picked it up at some kind of like school carnival or something. And the tagline, okay, so the copy that I had, and I still have it to this day, was the movie tie-in. And so there's the still of Carrie covered in blood and still on the stage. And that's the cover. And then there's, when you go into the middle, there's stills from the movie. So it's the movie tie-in. And the tagline is, "If The Exorcist made you shudder, Carrie will make you scream." And I've always had this love-hate relationship with The Exorcist, because I was 6 years old the first time I saw it. A babysitter watched it, and it scared the living crap out of me. I still can't watch it alone, okay? So, but at the same time, somehow that also set me off on this kind of liking horror, but kind of being scared by it. So I wanted to see if it was as scary as The Exorcist, which, spoiler, it's not. And I will also put in this number 4, It by Stephen King is my all-time favorite Stephen King book. I've read it many, many times. Elsewhere on this channel, I did a sort of a deep dive into real life things that inspired some of the stories or some of the background in it. You know, I mean, it's a book that's important to me. But Carrie was probably the first. So, I mean, if we're talking about what shaped me as a reader, that one was more important than it. Okay. Number 5. And I put To Kill a Mockingbird on this, but I feel disingenuous, because a lot of people say that To Kill a Mockingbird is their favorite story, and, you know, it sort of tags them as some kind of literary, you know, they like literature, they like Americana, blah, blah, blah. But to me, this was probably the first, or one of the first books that I read for school, that I had to read, but that I also really, really enjoyed. Sorry, I lost my light, but I think you can still see me. There's still enough light here. I love the characters. I thought the premise was so sad. And I mean, how can you not love Atticus Finch? But it also was the first time that I really, really enjoyed a book that I had to read for school. And that, to that point, was like unusual, because I usually didn't really enjoy all the books. Another book that I read that same year in 10th grade English class was The Chrysalids by John Wyndham. So it was kind of like the first taste of, hey, you know, literature can actually be enjoyable instead of the trash I normally read. Number 6, Ghoul by Michael Slade. Now, I'm sure there are better authors, there are probably better books, but I think Ghoul kind of shaped, or sort of served as a backdrop for a lot of who I was in high school. The main antagonists are a metal band. I was a metalhead in high school. The author is Canadian, and what I really appreciated about the book is that it featured a bibliography. And that's the only time any novel has had a bibliography, which intrigued me. And the third thing, I mean, obviously, again, Canadian author. I'm proudly nationalistic. I love Canada. I love being Canadian. Yes, our country has its flaws. Yes, there are political things that have put me in a pretty bad state in my life, but other things like free healthcare, I can't complain about. Okay, so anyway. And the other thing about the book is that it focuses, so Michael Slade is the pen name of, at the time, 3 authors who were all lawyers specializing in the field of criminal insanity. So there's a certain kind of level of intellect that they bring to the story that I found really interesting. And it also kind of sparked my interest in a certain level of armchair psychology. And I like psychology. I think it's interesting. Unfortunately, I'll probably never be able to afford to go back to school to study it, but it is a subject that I would pursue more if I could afford it. So, Ghoul by Michael Slade. And so while I was trying to make up my list, I got to thinking about my friend Glenn, and remembering that Michael Slade was one of the things that we talked about way back in the early days when we first connected. So, little shout out to Glenn, R.I.P. man. Still miss your comments over on Facebook. Number 7, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, with Ariel being a close second. Sylvia Plath is one of my literary heroes. I wrote a paper on her in high school, so of course at the time I read everything I could. And she also sparked my love of poetry. I love the images. I love the mood that she creates through poetry and through putting words on the page. And what's interesting about when I read Sylvia Plath, when I read about Sylvia Plath, because I wrote a story for an anthology a few years ago, and how do I explain this? Okay, this is yet another weird thing. I've always had this kind of stereotype in my head of the American, not quite the super rich, but the upper middle class, like your Kennedy class, or even just a little bit below that. And it's fed by John Irving and Bewitched. And so you have some job where you make a lot of money in the city and you live in the suburbs, whether it's Connecticut or New Jersey. This is fed by Judy Blume too, because this is one of the things that kind of some of her characters do. And so you have this job in the city, house in the suburbs, and you vacation, your winter vacation, you go skiing in Vermont. Your summer vacation, you go somewhere where there's a beach, like I don't know, Cape Cod, or, you know, where there's like white houses, and when I read The Bell Jar, because Sylvia Plath went to Smith, which is an Ivy League women's university, and she talked about her rich boyfriend who broke his leg skiing in Vermont, and she had this prestigious internship in New York City at a women's magazine, and so I always kind of had this idea that she fit into that stereotype of what I thought the American kind of upper middle class was. But then as I read more about her, what really impresses me about Sylvia Plath is that she had this ferocious work ethic. She was incredibly disciplined in writing and, you know, producing poems, sending them out, getting them published. I mean, she was just a maniac when it came to producing all of this stuff. Like, it was amazing how much writing she could accomplish in such a short time. And one of the things that extended that work ethic was the fact that she wasn't upper class. She didn't come from money. Her grandfather was he was some kind of university professor, so, you know, there was a house, but her mother was a single mother. I guess her dad, I can't remember if he died or if he left, but he wasn't around. So her mother was a single mother, and she worked at the university, but she taught typing classes. Very pink collar, very working class. And Sylvia was at Smith on a scholarship. And if she wanted to go on a skiing weekend, she had to work and save up money for it. And if she wanted to live in the dorm, she washed dishes. And if she wanted to go to school the next year, she nannied and she picked blueberries on a farm, you know, to get there. And that, I found that really intriguing, you know, set alongside of my concept of that stereotypical upper middle class, which turns out she wasn't. She was working class just like the rest of us. So found that interesting. Anyway, and Ariel was, you know, one of the products. She probably wrote 3 times as many poems as ended up being published in that book. Okay, number 8. The Handmaid's Tale, and alongside it, 1984. I first read The Handmaid's Tale in Canadian literature class, and I had a really cool prof whose work was in post-colonial literature. His name was Gary, and I love the language of it and the concept, just the idea of something that is high concept. And given the state of politics in the US right now, and sort of the control over women's reproductive rights, and the sort of pervasive idea on the Christian right of controlling women, it's gotten scarier and scarier as it, you know, as this machine that they want to make happen, like Project 2025, as it sort of keeps rolling along. And I watched the first season of the series, and I thought it was pretty good, but I kind of stopped after the first couple episodes of the second season because it started to go off the rails and away from the book. So I do have to pick that back up. But The Handmaid's Tale has been, it's also informed some of the voice that I try to write with, sort of, or I did when I was younger. I tried that sort of abstract, imagistic, literary kind of writing. Wasn't very good at it because, you know, my prose tends to be more straightforward. That's the journalist in me, you know, this is what happened, this is the result, blah, 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 right? And then 1984, I read that in high school. I read that a lot earlier than I read The Handmaid's Tale. But, you know, when you sit down and you do a comparison of the two, obviously The Handmaid's Tale is a feminine counterpart to 1984. And both have this theme of dystopia and, you know, government control, but really only over a certain circle of people. Once you get outside that circle, they kind of, you know, leave them to their own devices. But those two books are sort of important politically because they just seem to get truer every day. Oh, and the other thing about The Handmaid's Tale, author goals. I would absolutely love to, one, create a book or a character that is just as relevant 40 years after I write it, 50 years, 100 years, as it is when it's first published. Two, author goals. I really want to write a book that gets banned. Just so I can say, yep, my book got banned. And the third thing, I would absolutely, as an author, I would absolutely love to be fansplained, which I saw over on Twitter a few years ago. Margaret Atwood was saying something about The Handmaid's Tale, and somebody commented, have you even read the book? So, number 9, are we at number 9 already? Yeah, I think so. So number 9 is The Diviners by Margaret Atwood. Margaret Lawrence. Yes, Canadian authors named Margaret. I get them mixed up. So this book is, The Diviners is my all-time favorite novel. Because of the characters and because it's one of the few books that is actually realistic about the life of a working writer. Spoiler, she's got, you know, publications and publications, but she still has to work crappy jobs to make ends meet and live in some really sketchy places. So I thought that was realistic. But what I love about The Diviners is that I watched this video, it was a documentary interview with Mrs. Lawrence before she passed away. So this would have been sometime in the early 80s. And she said that when she sat down to write her, it's called the Manawaka cycle. If you're not familiar with Margaret Lawrence's work, she wrote a number of works that were set in a fictionalized version of her hometown. So she grew up in a small town in Manitoba, and this is the fictional Manawaka is the fictional counterpart to that. And I think the town in Manitoba is something like Neepawa, something like that. Anyway, but there's a little Margaret Lawrence museum out there. So yeah, if I ever win a lottery or decide to travel or whatever, that is going to be on my bucket list. I'd love to go and see the little Margaret Lawrence museum. But watching that video, something really struck a chord in me when I was watching her talk about her writing. She said that the Manawaka cycle was the first time that she created characters who talked like she did. And I thought that was really interesting as a writer, to make your characters ring true to, to people that you actually know, to people that you would actually sit down and have a conversation with. And I've always kind of carried that when I write dialogue. I try to make it authentic, and I try to make it, these characters talk the way I do. And I will also put a little shout out, the Manawaka cycle. Another book that I really enjoyed from that one was The Jest of God, and especially the relationship between Rachel and her mother. That one really hit home. It's probably a whole lot of what my life would have looked like if I had stayed home to take care of my mother and not left home for university and to build my own life somewhere else. So that one was a little scary. But yeah, The Diviners by Margaret Lawrence. And I guess, so that's 9. And 10, I don't know what to put in the illustrious 10th spot. Obviously, there's a lot of horror novels that I could put in there, a lot of exciting books that I've discovered, since I've been doing reviews and actually seeking out interesting, diverse, modern authors. I could talk more about the trashier books that I've always loved, my Jackie Collins and Sidney Sheldon and whatever, because those are a large part of what I read too. But I think the books that I want to talk about, this is so ridiculous, but the Star Trek Memories books. My friend Matt, who passed away, it's been 20 years. I can't believe it's been 20 years since he passed, but I still think about him a lot every day. And I still miss him so much. But he made me read all of the Star Trek Memories books that we could get our hands on. So I read the Star Trek Memories and Star Trek Movie Memories by William Shatner. And I read the George Takei one. I can't remember what that one was called. And then later I found Nichelle Nichols' book, which was called Beyond Uhura. And I still have the James Doohan book, but I didn't quite finish that one. I think I read the first half or something. And James Doohan is great because not only is he Canadian, or at least raised in Canada, but he is from my hometown. He didn't go to my high school. He went to the other high school down the street, but he's from Sarnia. So, I thought I'd talk about those because my friend Matt made me read all of them this one summer. Matt was an English major, and he said that, he actually read more after school than he ever did during school. But I think the reason that I bring that up, and Ghoul, and talking with Glenn about it back when we first met, I think that one of the things that really does shape my response to books now is, there's two things. One is nostalgia, and you see a lot of TikTok videos by Gen Xers. Oh, you'll remember this music, or name these name these songs. And so there's a lot of nostalgia for the things that you said and did during your youth. You'll notice that a lot of these books are books that I read as a child or teenager, or even into my university days. And the other thing I think that really does inform my response to books now that I'm officially more than middle-aged. I'm old. I don't even know how many years I have left, but I hope they're at least good ones. And that's grief. As the people that you knew when you were young, they start passing away unexpectedly, especially when you don't expect it. It's not the end of a long illness. It's just suddenly they're not there anymore. And you're left with the memories of them, and also the grief of missing them. And I think that how we do get as attached to characters in a book as we do to people in real life. And so now, when somebody that you're attached to in a book dies, you respond a little bit differently than when you're 10 years old and you've never lost anybody that's close to you. Or at least I do. I don't know, maybe I'm just putting too much into it, but I do think that the experience of grief shapes some of my responses to the world in general, but especially to the things that I read now, where maybe it didn't 20 years ago, or 25 or 30 years ago, right? So anyway, that's my thought to ponder. I hope this list was enlightening. I hope you're reading lots of good horror. Have a great day.